Thank you very much for having me here, and thank you very much for being so patient and waiting. I was very glad that you got everybody up before, because it was getting to that time of the day.
Yeah.
The presentations have been very interesting, and what I've found is that there are so many common elements in what we've been talking about today, but there are also major differences. And what I'm going to talk about is, with Australia, both of those things happen because of the way that we operate as a country, and I'll talk more about that today. In 2013, Australia legislated to require every school to implement a school improvement plan. So this was done at an Australian-wide level. So it's law that every school has to write a plan. The plan was to look at student learning in the school context, and has to have specific timelines, and it has to explain how the improvements will be measured. The process is in essence outcomes-based, because there are explicit expectations for each school, and the measures of accountability to these expectations are published annually on the My School website. And that's a publicly accessible website that even you can look at. This includes performance on the National Assessment Program, Literacy and Numeracy, NAPLAN, and progress over time, final year graduation and certification, including vocational education and training, and student attendance rates. Some of the stated expectations are deliberately high. For example, the parties, and I'll talk more about who they are later, agreed to new ambitious national targets with respect to Australia's international performance. So the first of these is that Australia will be placed in the top 5 countries internationally in reading, mathematics and science by 2025. And you would have seen that we didn't even make some of the lists that were put up earlier. So that is a very big ask. The second one was that Australia would be considered a high quality and high equity schooling system by international standards by 2025. And I think on most measures we're one of the lowest equity countries in the world. So again, a very big ask. So, and there's a year put on this notice, it's 2025. The Australian, so there's got an act, but there are regulations that go with the act. And in those regulations, the tool that was recommended for the school improvement plan was the National School Improvement Tool. This tool was written by Professor Jeff Masters, who is the CEO of ACER. And if you've got the slides already, and I think most of you have access to them, on the third slide there's a link to the tool, and you can go to that already. What this tool does is it's to provide information so that the school can self-assess, but also
Thank you.
yeah, I'm not there yet. It's just a moment. So the tool is designed to self-assess, but also for external assessors to come in. So what prompted the government to do this? So some context. Australia is a federation. There are 6 states and 2 territories. Each state is responsible legally for education. So the national government is not legally responsible, each state is. And that complicates decision-making about education. The decisions about education policy are made at a Council of Australian Governments. So that is the premiers of each state, the Chief Minister of each territory, the Prime Minister of Australia, and just to throw in for good measure, the President of the Local Council Association, because local councils also get involved with making decisions about education. You can imagine what it's like to be a principal in Australia. It's a minefield, I can assure you. The COAG has an education council, a body of the ministers of education from each state, which meets and advises the COAG, the Council of Governments. Okay, so there's part of the background. As I said, each state is responsible by law, for education in Australia. And this is for compulsory schooling, which is for children under 16 years of age, and also for children over 16 years of age. Sorry, they're not children legally after 16, but for those students over 16. The problem again is that some laws are set by the state and some by the Australian government. So the Australian Education Act, in which the school improvement was legislated, can be interpreted differently in each state, and in practice is. So you can imagine the difficulties with implementing law in Australia, but also implementing school improvement change. Further complication. There are 3 sectors of education in Australia. The first of these are the public schools. So these are the government-run schools, which are run by each state. These are funded mainly by state funds, and this is important, I'll come to that later, but also by federal funds, by Australian government funds. Then there are non-government Catholic schools, obviously run by the Catholic Church, funded by the state and the Australian government, and also by the Catholic Church. And finally, there are non-government independent schools. And these are truly autonomous schools, and I was the principal of several of these schools in different states in Australia. So these are funded by parent fees, the Australian government, the state government, and also by the founding bodies, you know, like the Anglican Church or whoever founded the school. So finally, every school in Australia is then funded by several different bodies. The state and territory government, the Australian government, and then parents and caregivers. Now, that funding is important because if you can't make something happen by law, you make it happen by money. We've seen these before today. And it's interesting that I've left Korea on these slides because this is important. So these are just the PISA scores, but obviously the TIM scores and the Pearl scores are also important in this context. And these are the reasons why that drove the Australian government to adopt the legislation. It happened at each state as well, because these results are published at a state level, and states actually talk about being better at these international tests than other states. Again, how accurate they are, because you can imagine in the Northern Territory, for instance, there are only something like 20,000 students. So those results are not significant, and they can be affected significantly by changes in population. So the Australian and state governments decided that these results were not good enough, and they decided then to set a school improvement plan, or to ask schools to do that. And then they expected that to improve results across the country. But the question, as we've seen several times today, is not so much how you improve one school, or even improve learning in one classroom, and then how that goes to improve learning across the school. Because, across the country, I mean. Because in the end, I found it difficult enough to improve learning in my own classrooms when I was a teacher. Then, when I became a head of school, to improve learning across the whole school was complex. And then to take those next steps and to legislate that at a country level is very difficult. On top of that, as we've heard about today, the government at the time, which was a Labor government, introduced what was called the Education Revolution, and there were a number of other initiatives that came along with that. As we go through these, you can imagine the responses from teachers when all of this happened pretty much at the same time. The initiatives in themselves are actually quite positive, but because they happened in such a short period of time, it has overloaded schools to a large extent. The first of these was the Australian curriculum. Now, I've been teaching or involved in education for over 40 years in Australia, and there have been a number of attempts at a national curriculum. But again, because we have state governments, it's been very difficult. So to get as far as we have is fantastic. And we now have a foundation to Year 10 curriculum in English, history, mathematics and science. There are curricula in those 4 areas for senior secondary, Year 11 and 12, but they are not endorsed by every state so far. The 4 that I mentioned from foundation to Year 10 are. There are now 6 other curricula published for foundation to Year 10, but they have not been endorsed yet. I'm going to put the next 3 up together. John Hattie was mentioned before. He now runs what is called the Australian Institute for School Leaders, Teachers and School Leaders. And they administer the 3 areas that you can see there, the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers, the National Professional Standards for Principals, and the National Standards for Initial Teacher Education. The last one is still being debated, what those standards will be, but they're in draft form. You can see already, this all happened since 2011, so I haven't got halfway down the list yet. At the same time, in 2010, the Educational Services Australia was established, and that's a web-based service to provide resources to all Australian schools. It's actually accessed by New Zealand schools as well, and funded partly from New Zealand too. It's an incredibly rich resource, and again can be accessed publicly, so you can access it as well. And a lot of the resources are written by teachers. So it's an incredibly rich resource area. But Educational Services Australia is also now providing assessment materials in the way that was talked about in Hong Kong, so online assessments that teachers can use and build themselves to assess students in a number of different curricular areas. The My School website, it does provide consistent outcome data on every school in Australia, including NAPLAN results, and also academic, attendance, school profile, enrolment and finances. And this is for every school in Australia. So that information is again publicly available, and unfortunately does lead to league tables. The media gets hold of this and produces league tables very quickly. The National Safe Schools Framework was also introduced in 2010, and This again is a really positive initiative because it provides a lot of resources on student well-being. Not here about behaviour, but about managing the social and emotional issues that students face in schools. And finally, this is one that has only just been finalised. So there's now a nationally consistent system of collecting data for students with special needs. And the actual law was in place in 2005, but it's taken 10 years to actually get the states to agree on a consistent way of collecting the information. So this now means that students with learning needs will, and other other needs that affect their learning, will actually be provided with the same, well, supposedly consistent support. And the final one, I said that was the final one, but there is a review of funding for schools that is going on. And this, we thought was agreed, but since the new government, the Liberal government, has come in 2 years ago, this is now being debated again about how funding would be provided. So students with learning needs, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island background, ESL background, were all going to be provided with extra funding. And the idea was that every student would be provided funding regardless of which school system they were involved in. So each of these initiatives, as I said, is exemplary in its intent, but the data that's provided and the way that it's provided on the My School website makes it drive school improvement, rather than, as we've heard many times today, talking about school improvement from the school level. The first education department to look at this and to make a decision about doing something about it was the Queensland Department of Education. And they approached Professor Masters, who then wrote a framework for them, which was adopted. So they were the first state to start looking at school improvement across the whole state. And they've been doing it the longest using the National School Improvement Tool. So then in 2011, the rest of the states saw what Queensland was doing and decided to endorse the tool as well. And then in 2013, that became law. So what was different about this approach? Because as I've said, everything that I've talked about so far is very outcomes oriented. Published results, driven system, and high expectations on the schools. I'm going to get you to do something. I want you to answer 2 questions. So there are 2 photographs coming up, and what I want you to do is to look at these and make a list of the learning that you're seeing taking place in these classrooms. I hope you can see that at the back. Here's the second classroom. Okay, here's another question. Now, I'm going to let you into a little secret. The first of the photographs, and I couldn't find ones of me doing this, but the first one is a classroom very much like the way I operate. Involved with the students down on the floor a lot of the time. In fact, I had one of my supervisors come into one of my classes and ask, "Where is Mr. Hassell?" And I stood up. The second classroom is a 1950s classroom in Australia. That's also my experience. And I learnt in that classroom. We've heard today about different models of classrooms and the different ways that they operate. What I was surprised about is the classroom that you showed us before is very much like an early childhood classroom with different learning centres and movement around the classroom. I'm also a PE teacher, and that's the way I used to operate my classes all the time. The final question. What else would you need to know to answer the second question? Okay, the reason I've done this is that this is the basis for the tool. Because what Professor Masters says is that what you should do when you're looking at school improvement is to look at the direct evidence of what schools are doing. So, you know, even though we look at the second classroom and we look at that as an old-fashioned, not very positive way of doing things now, learning's still happening. And fortunately or unfortunately, I've still observed many of these classrooms when I've done school improvement visits. But learning is still happening in those classrooms. What we need to do is to make sure that we don't make preemptive judgments. And what's important, I've found, both in my practice in schools and also now in my research, is that every context is different. Schools are as individual as we are. And so what works in one school, as we've heard many times today, will not necessarily work in another. And in fact, even what happens is over 5 to 10 years, that school changes as well. And that is the biggest question for me, is how do you sustain school improvement? I've seen many of the examples of it happening, but it's how you sustain it. And what Professor Masters has done is he's looked at, again, researched the principles behind school improvement, looked at the ways that systems do it, and also researched the literature. And what he's done is come up with these 9 domains. And you'll see that there are common elements in a lot of the presentations that have been made today. So the first is an explicit improvement agenda. And this is set by the school community, not by the leadership on their own, but the whole community. So it's making a decision about what is going to improve student learning for that school. And then how long that agenda might take. We've heard about this one today over and over again, and this became a particular interest of mine because we've heard about grades today in schools, but how do you compare an A in an English class to an A in a mathematics class? Or 75% in science and 75% in art? At some point, you've got to make those decisions if you're going to talk about school improvement. And it's talking with schools about how to make those judgments and talking with teachers about what they assess when they're making those judgments. Then you can compare the standardised data to that information. And that's been something that's been really important because the data that's critical is the data that's collected in the school. And this data is not just, as we've heard today, academic, but it's also well-being data, attendance data, and any other information that can support or detract from student learning. This one is critical. In a number of conversations that I've had today, when I became a teacher, my aim was to teach children. And that very quickly became, how do they learn? And how do I improve their learning? This is what this is talking about. Does every teacher, every staff member, every educational assistant, principal, everybody in the school, do they believe that everyone student in that school can learn? And that's what the culture that promotes learning is about. The targeted use of school resources, so that this is about actually resourcing student learning. During one of my school inspections, I had a very interesting question. I just employed a cleaner to clean a toilet that was backing up all the time in the school. This was in China. The visiting team asked me, how did the employment of that cleaner improve student learning? It was quite easy when I thought about it. I don't want sick children. But it took me a little while to answer that question, and you can imagine why. An expert teaching team. Now, straight away, people think about university degrees or other ways. But this is not talking about that. This is, again, talking about teachers being expert in teaching children and them learning. So that can happen in a number of different ways. And again, that's in the context of the school. And I include in that team the education assistants as well, the people who are in the classroom assisting the teacher with the student learning. The systematic curriculum delivery. This one's interesting because it's not just talking about the curriculum, but it's talking about the way it's delivered. Again, an example of this one, I did a survey of curriculum in one of the schools that I was head of. I found that the history of Egypt had been taught 6 times through the school, so K to 12. I had one very smart boy who just rewrote his assignment every time, improved it slightly, but he was able to do that same assignment each time. That's not systematic curriculum delivery. Now, this one, what it relates to again is individual learning by students. So this is talking about the teacher knowing how each of the students in their class learn and differentiating the way that they teach for that student. And that is an easy sentence, but it's easier said than done. This is one of the most difficult ones to work with teachers on. And that leads to effective pedagogical practice. Again, this is one that teachers who are focused on student learning don't have any difficulty with. But teachers who are teaching the curriculum and teaching to make sure that they cover what they're teaching find this very difficult. Because, again, pedagogy is talking about responding to students as they learn. And the final one, this one was not in the original Queensland framework, but was added when the national tool was written. And this one is critical because what we're finding is that schools that have more connections outside of the school premises are actually improving much quicker. let you read this. Okay, this is important because what Professor Masters said was that somebody else could have done the same study that he did and come up with different domains, and that's possible. But what's been interesting to me today is that there's been a lot of common elements in what we've been presenting. And so, in my experience with the tool, these 9 domains do come up over and over again. It's a simple tool, and I'll show you in a minute one of the domains. The way that schools use it is in 4 different ways. They first of all, some schools choose to write a documented self-evaluation, and that's all they do. That's sometimes done by the leadership, sometimes done by the school, the teachers, sometimes by the community. And then they set their own agenda and follow it themselves. Another way that this is approached is that the school board, and this is increasingly happening with public schools in Australia which are becoming independent public schools, the school board and the school leadership conduct the evaluation and then work with the school community on implementing it. The third one is that they do the same process but then invite an external evaluator in. And at the moment, the only body to train the evaluators is ACR. So we have a team of evaluators that visit schools all around Australia. And then the final one is that the team, the evaluation team, and we've heard about this in a number of contexts today, are invited into the school to do a full evaluation, and that can vary. Some large schools it takes 3 to 4 days. A smaller school might take 2 days. That's with the actual visit, but the evaluation itself can be conducted over 3 or 4 months. And then some schools actually invite the team back in to mentor the process. And in some schools that mentoring process is taking 3 to 5 years. So it depends on how the school chooses to implement this process. This is the first domain. And I've just chosen a couple of the criteria. This domain the schools find the most difficult to self-assess. Now, can you all read that? And if you read that criteria, so this is the extent to which the whole school community is committed to and explicit about how they want to improve and what they want to improve. And we've heard this several times today. I'll give you 2 examples. One was a school that teaches students straight off the street. These are students that have not been to school for a long time. Their explicit improvement agenda for 2 years was to get students back into class and to keep them there. All right, at the other end of the scale was a school that chose as their explicit improvement agenda that they wanted their students to excel in the final year exams. Now I'm running out of time, so I better
I'll skip that one and I'll go to this one. And again, you can see how complex that is and the range of students that it's covering. With this one, it's sometimes taken a school a whole year to actually gather the data and to work out how they're going to implement this part of this criteria, just this one criteria. So it's deceptively simple. We're at a stage where we don't have any empirical evidence from the use of this tool yet. It's been implemented, as I said, in Queensland for about 3 years, and we've started to gather data from there. And what I'm talking about here is we want to actually look at whether the tool does improve student learning. Anecdotally and in observation, it does. But again, we want to look at the sustainability of student learning improvement and therefore school improvement across whole systems. Thank you very much for your attention at this late in the day. If you're more interested in the details about the tool, you can see the contact information up there. You have the slides. Thank you very much.